Joaquin El Chapo Guzman sits at his cell in ADX Florence, the USA's so-called escape-proof lockup. He hasn't seen any natural light in years. He has to sleep with the lights in his cell on, something he says causes extreme mental anguish. And when he does get to leave his cell for an hour a day, he's just transported to another kind of cell by prison officers who barely speak to him. As prison officials have admitted, this kind of incarceration is a fate worse than death. But they also know that El Chapo has pulled off the unbelievable before, and perhaps he's thinking about doing it again. Today, you'll find out why this man is about as lockdown gets, and if indeed El Chapo could somehow disappear again from the clutches of the law. He did once say, "I've tunneled out of prison before, and I can do it again." We'll talk about the possibility of a breakout happening later, but let's first look at how El Chapo became known as the drug lord of the underworld. Say what you want about El Chapo, but you can't deny he was an industrious little fella. He was born into poverty on April 4th, 1957, in a little place called La Tuna in Sinaloa, Mexico. This was a small rural community where many people made their money from farming. That's what his parents did, his pop Emilio Guzman Bustillos and his mother Maria Consuelo Lorera Perez. Life was hard for El Chapo, his 2 younger sisters, and 4 younger brothers. It was so hard that he actually started out having 3 older brothers, but they all died from natural causes very early in life. And what did these farmers, cattle ranchers by trade do to make ends meet? They branched out, of course, into opium, the stuff that can end up as heroin flowing through the veins of folks north of the border. El Chapo was special, and he showed that from a very young age. He gave up school when he was in the 3rd grade, and barely being able to read or write, decided to go into business himself. To help the family out, he sold oranges and candies, although it was never enough to make his violent father happy. His mother, though, she saw something in the kid. She'd watch him as he cut up little pieces of paper, tied them into bundles with elastic bands, and pretended he was rich. She later said about that, he'd count and recount them, then tie them up in little piles. Ever since he was little, he always had hopes. El Chapo left that godforsaken home when he was 15, and everything changed. This kid with big ambition saw a way out of poverty. His ticket to success lay in an illegal commodity, that of marijuana, a plant that could be grown cheaply and sent to the USA, where it could fetch enough money to make El Chapo a happy young man. It was at this point that he started working under the tutorship of his uncle, Pedro Aviles Perez. Perez, nicknamed the Mountain Lion, was what you'd call a first-generation Mexican narco, being one of the original entrepreneurs to flood the US with copious amounts of Mexican weed. The stuff was smoked with abandon by the many members of the so-called counterculture in the US in the late 60s and early 70s. But the problem with weed is it stinks a fair bit and it's pretty bulky. It's hard to say how much it costs because prices differ everywhere and it depends on how much you buy and who you buy it from. But let's say the average cost per kilo is about $2,000. That's not much, but what is a lot is the cost of a kilo of cocaine, which could cost in the region of $20,000 to $30,000 in the US today. So, in the 70s, when disco music was becoming a thing in the US and hippie culture made a way for self-loving group of people who liked snorting rails from nightclub bathrooms, the whole trafficking game changed. Cocaine became the new moneymaker. It still is, but let's save our conclusions about the war on drugs until the end of the show. In 1978, El Chapo's uncle was shot dead by federal cops, probably as a result of him being set up by another trafficker. Then the man called the original Mexican drug lord came onto the scene. He was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. This man became the godfather. He was untouchable, having officials and politicians in his pockets and having those connections in Colombia, where the coke was coming from. He made deals with other Mexican traffickers who had their own plazas in what became a federation of traffickers. But then, in 1984, something happened that changed everything. A massive marijuana plantation owned by Gallardo's Guadalajara cartel was raided and burned to the ground by the Mexican military, and it seemed the man that had orchestrated this was a US DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar. To say that Gallardo was furious would be an understatement. This 1,000-hectare plantation was worth a staggering $8 billion a year for the cartel, so with the help of some corrupt Mexican officials, Gallardo had Camarena kidnapped. The outcome was 30 hours of brutal torture with heavy objects and drills, and Camarena's body being wrapped in plastic and dumped in a field. The DEA was less than pleased, and so launched an investigation. To cut a long story short, that investigation was somewhat successful because by 1989, both Gallardo and his lieutenant, Rafael Caro Quintero, were behind bars. As you know, what tends to happen when arrests are made and some big people go down, a so-called power vacuum starts to form. These are usually torrid affairs that involve a lot of bloodshed as people fight for supremacy. After the Federation was abandoned, various cartels did their own thing. One of them was the Sinaloa cartel. At this point in the late 80s, the cartel was already making millions from trafficking cocaine. In the 90s, it got better, and in 1995, it was solely headed by who the DEA said was the new boss, El Chapo Guzman, after his partner Hector Luis Palma Salazar was arrested. They were good at trafficking too, using a network of tunnels to get the stuff across the border and into the USA. They used aircraft now and again, and perhaps their pièce de résistance was putting cocaine into chili pepper cans under the brand La Comadre, and then sending them to the US via trains and trucks. Word on the street is they got around $500 million worth of cocaine across the border using this method alone, with the packers in the warehouse apparently getting very high during the stuffing process. It was these fast methods that impressed the Colombians, who gave El Chapo the new name of El Rapido. As El Chapo and co were raking in the millions, some people in the Sinaloa started calling Chapo Santa Claus and Robin Hood, with the reason being that he'd been investing quite a lot of money into the state's infrastructure, and for many people doing more good than any corrupt politician had ever done. Let's not forget, though, those who stood in his way generally got murdered. Then in 1989, there was a bit of a falling out between the Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel and the Sinaloa boys. To cut the story short, El Chapo sent one of his main men to meet with the brothers, and that ended with Ramon Felix killing the man. Not only that, the brothers then told their men to murder members of the guy's family to prevent any kind of reprisal. These brothers were insanely dangerous, starting a trend in beheading and at one point throwing someone's innocent family members off a very high bridge. Things were turning ugly in Mexico, and you can be sure that El Chapo wasn't going to take these insults lying down. In the early 90s, his men went on their own killing sprees, taking out members of the Tijuana cartel. And it was at this point that the Mexican government had to take a stance. They couldn't just let blood flow through the streets as it had been doing, even though a good number of politicians, police, and other officials were getting rich from the proceeds of drug trafficking. In 1992, the Felix brothers opened fire on Guzman with AK-47s as he was driving through the streets of Guadalajara. Guzman got away. Not long after, some of his men, while posing as cops, walked into a nightclub and pretty much shot the place up. 6 people were killed, but the Felix brothers were apparently in the bathroom at the time and managed to escape. The bullets kept flying in this turf war, and mothers kept burying their boys. But you could say that the culmination of all this was what happened when Tijuana cartel hitmen turned up at a Guadalajara International Airport on May 24, 1993. They'd been informed that El Chapo was there, and he was hiding in a white Mercury Grand Marquis car. Naturally, the men filled the thing with bullets, although they should have checked who was inside it at first because El Chapo was certainly not in the car. But the Cardinal and Archbishop of Guadalajara, named Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, was. They'd just taken out a man of the cloth, something that spurred Mexican President Carlos Salinas de Gortari into action. El Chapo, by the way, had been at the airport that day, but upon hearing the calamity had made a getaway, something you'll soon see he was very good at, and possibly the best escapologist in Mexican criminal history. So, the president was outraged. The good people of Mexico were outraged. The Tijuana cartel were like, damn, guess we can forget about that ticket to heaven. Their pictures and other suspects ended up in the newspapers with a bounty of $5 million for every head. One of those heads was El Chapo. While in hiding, he handed over $200 million to one of his most trusted men and said, if anything goes wrong, use this to take care of my family. He gave that same amount to some of his other men to ensure that his cartel's business could keep going if he were to be arrested. It was then that he forged a passport using the name Jorge Ramos Perez, with the intention of hiding out in Guatemala for a while, although at this point the authorities were hot on his tail. He paid Guatemalan military official a cool $1.2 million to ensure safe passage, but it seems that the official had set El Chapo up. On June 9, 1993, Guatemalan troops swooped in on El Chapo as he was staying at a hotel on the Guatemala-Mexican border. In no time at all, he was sitting on a military plane in handcuffs, thinking about how his first stint behind bars would go at Mexico's Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 2, perhaps one of the best prisons in the world for anyone who has suitcases full of cash at their disposal. Now we come to part 2 of this show, the first of El Chapo's great escapes. But before we do that, we have to ask just how much money this short-in-stature drug lord had at the time. It's always been a tricky question, foremost because traffickers have said the authorities exaggerate how much cash they have. That cash made from drugs pays for a vast operation that might include up to hundreds of people. On top of that, they hardly file their taxes, and often they keep their money offshore. That's why when they're caught, the authorities never seem to get their hands on the millions or billions, and even if they did, if they were corrupt, would they always report it? Well, look at it this way. There have been cocaine hauls in the US of 20 tons. The street price for that would be about $1.3 billion. Sure, as former traffickers have said on podcasts, no one person gets anything close to that. But still, when you consider that there's always cocaine in the US and in Europe, some of the traffickers are making many millions, some of them billions. That's even after they paid scores of officials, the suppliers, the transporters, and various middlemen for every shipment. Right now, someone is selling cocaine. Someone is doing some lines, perhaps even in the British Houses of Parliament bathrooms, just as the Prime Minister says he is absolutely determined to fight drugs. That actually happened. There's no doubt people are racking up lines in some of New York's banking offices and certainly at a nightclub or in a living room near you, wherever you are in the world. That's a lot of coke for the cartels to work with. It was said at his height El Chapo was making $2 to $4 billion a year, but you can bet your life he never had that at his disposal. Still, he was doing all right, just as his enemies were. Just to give you an idea of how much power the cartels had and still have, when that cardinal was shot, the Catholic Church in Mexico didn't think it was a hit gone wrong. Who on earth, they said, would confuse a cardinal for a drug trafficker? They also said, isn't it weird how this murdered cardinal had been talking for a long time about Mexican politicians being in bed with the narcos? They thought it was a purposeful hit on the cardinal with men in suits involved. So, do you really think El Chapo, with his many millions and superabundant power, was going to stay behind bars for long? He got 20 years, after which he told the TV cameras, "I am but a simple farmer." If he was, it's strange that he had servants in prison, that even the guards were at his beck and call. It's strange that he was treated like a king and was allowed to run his empire from his luxurious cell, and that his brother and business partner Arturo could come and go as he pleased. The investigative journalist Anabel Hernandez said he contacted judges and politicians from there and regularly had sit-downs with business associates. It should also be mentioned here that it was later said in court that El Chapo was working with the DEA, just as drug agencies all over the world sometimes work with traffickers if they agree to set up other traffickers. One U.S. critic said El Chapo was duping U.S. agencies into fighting its enemies. Later, the hitman and gangster named Juan Carlos Ramirez testified in a U.S. court saying that Mr. Chapo was bribing corrupt DEA agents with prostitutes, gifts, and apartments. As the years passed, people talked about El Chapo being El Dueño of the prison, which basically means the owner. When he was bored with business, he sometimes had prostitutes smuggled in or lovers, and often came with a handful of Viagra pills. He did at least have to go through some of the motions that regular prisoners face, and that was seeing a prison psychologist. After meeting with El Chapo, this man gave his assessment, saying he was egocentric, narcissistic, shrewd, persistent, tenacious, meticulous, discriminating, and secretive. We should just say here that during his lifetime, El Chapo had 18 kids with 7 different women. One of them was a former police officer named Zulema Hernandez, who wrote to Chapo when he was behind bars. As you know, he wasn't too literate, so when he wrote to her from prison, he had some hired help. One of the letters he wrote gives us some insight not only into how he sounded, but also the fact that he was planning to leave. He wrote, "Love, Christmas is around the corner, and nothing would make me happier than being close to you, your skin and your lips, but everything is uncertain. Even though I haven't lost sight of seeing you, I don't want to promise any specific day because then it doesn't work out." By the way, this woman ended up being shot and killed sometimes later, and a Z carved into her body. That's because the hit was the work of El Chapo's enemies, the outfit known as Los Zetas. She'd helped run his drug business from prison, but as things tend to go, it was a risky venture. After 8 years living in relative luxury, he was indicted in the US for money laundering and trafficking obscene amounts of cocaine across the borders, and it was looking like he might be extradited after the Supreme Court of Mexico made a deal with the US. The last thing he wanted was to end up in a US prison where bribing officers wasn't so easy, so he planned his escape. On January 19, 2001, as one story goes, he bribed prison guard Francisco El Chito Camberos Rivera. The officer opened up the cell and Chapo got in a laundry basket, after which, with the help of a maintenance man, he was rolled out the front door. The maintenance guy helped Chapo into his car trunk and drove him to a gas station, whereupon he went inside to buy something. El Chapo slipped out of the trunk and did that famous vanishing act of his. Camberos did some prison time for that, although the prison authorities had apparently also been paid, as had the cops, who didn't bother looking for El Chapo until he'd had enough time to leave the state. This all cost El Chapo in the region of $2.5 million. But did it really all go down that way? No, it didn't. According to that brave journalist Anabel Hernandez, she discovered documents and video footage that revealed El Chapo hadn't done the laundry basket thing and instead had left the prison through the door wearing a police uniform. She said that high-ranking cops had all been paid, as had various ministers and prison officials. They'd helped him every step of the way and had been paid handsomely to do so. They even gave him a police escort, and as a matter of convenience, they were at the prison the day after for when they had to go on TV and react to the escape. Pundits have since pointed out that it wasn't just about the money. The government was desperate for the bloody fighting to stop, and it hoped that Chapo would again bring the cartels together with a kind of new Pax Mafiosa, just like that old federation. The same pundits said it was pretty obvious that for a while the only people who got arrested seemed to be El Chapo's enemies, as if the authorities were actually working with the Sinaloa cartel. You can be sure that those enemies were upset about this, believing El Chapo was playing both criminal and informer, which has always been the case with law enforcement and organized crime. As if that wasn't bad enough, El Chapo also had some help from the people who generally don't call themselves criminals or crime fighters. Those were the banks. El Chapo needed to launder hundreds of millions of dollars, and to do that he went through the normal banking system. Investigators would later reveal that he used the American bank Wachovia Bank, now a part of Wells Fargo, and also the largest bank in Europe, HSBC. They both got found out and admitted some wrongdoing, but no one ever went to prison for it. The fines, although large, didn't really make a dent in the bank's profits, and so the authorities and the banks, you could say, both took something from El Chapo's hard-earned blood money. Everyone was a winner besides El Chapo and the folks that suffered the damage from the actual drugs. The war raged on, and more of the same was about to come. El Chapo and the other cartels ratcheted up the violence after he escaped in 2001. Mexico soon started breaking records, with drug murders going through the roof, as well as tens of thousands of people going missing over the years. The violence also started to get a lot more brutal, as you might have seen in those videos involving kneeling men and chainsaws. At this point, there was still a huge bounty on El Chapo's head, and you can be sure when he traveled, he rarely didn't use a bulletproof car. They made some songs about him in Mexico. Now having the status of a legend, it's reported that he'd sometimes roll up at a restaurant with a bunch of armed guards, and before walking out, pay for everyone who was in the restaurant. People would talk about this new cult figure, saying he's here, he's there, he's everywhere, but the authorities had no idea where he was. They looked from one part of Mexico to the other, raiding houses, making arrests, but the elusive El Chapo was like a ghost. Then, in 2004, after a tip-off, the Mexican Air Force gave him a surprise visit when he was having a party at the Sinaloa ranch. Helicopters flew overhead, and men in masks descended to the ground only to discover El Chapo had once again slipped off. Still, some journalists later said that they never actually intended to arrest him. Yet again, they said the authorities needed to look like they were doing a good job fighting the drug war. Almost the same thing happened again later in 2004, but this time the authorities were only about 10 minutes late. They did at least come away from the raid with El Chapo's laptop and some photographs showing that he had been at the ranch and also put on a few pounds. They burned down the ranch and set fire to his cars, which you can be sure appeared on TV for public consumption. And yet again, there were some Mexican journalists saying the whole thing was for show. How come they were always a few minutes late, and how come El Chapo had the escape abilities of the Roadrunner? In 2005, he was seen again, this time eating at a restaurant along with 15 guards brandishing AK-47s. One of El Chapo's men apparently stood up and said to the other eaters, "Gentlemen, please give me a moment of your time. A man is going to come in, the boss. We will ask you to remain in your seats, the doors will be closed, and nobody is allowed to leave. You will also not be allowed to use your cellulars. Do not worry, if you do everything that's asked of you, nothing will happen. Continue eating, and don't ask for your check, the boss will pay. Thank you." El Chapo then arrived and ordered some steak, after which he shook some hands and left. As promised, everyone got a free meal that day. That's the story anyway. Some people believe people said stuff like that just to create some added mythology behind, for some, a Mexican hero. In 2006, the new Mexican president Felipe Calderón assured his people that he would put an end to the violence, declaring a more serious war on drugs using incorruptible forces from the Mexican military. 53,000 people related to the cartels were eventually arrested, but guess what? The Sinaloa cartel was pretty much untouched, with only 1,000 of its members feeling the wrath of the law. Investigations later revealed that Chapo had given some of his own cartel members up and ratted on tons of other cartels after he made a deal with the DEA and Calderón. This help he gave to the U.S. authorities led to that indictment going away in 2008. As these arrests were compelling some U.S. politicians to talk about a significant victory and making El Chapo not very popular with the people he'd given up, cocaine and blood flowed in the streets as it always had done. But now both streams were about to get bigger. Meanwhile, more rumors surfaced that El Chapo had been seen, sometimes in Guatemala or Honduras, or again, showing some largesse in Mexican restaurants. Apparently one time he did that in Juarez, the home of the Juarez cartel, and after they found out, they burned the place to the ground. In 2009, the Mexican government said anyone who gives us information leading to the arrest of El Chapo would receive 30 million Mexican pesos, and at that same time, the U.S. government put a $5 million bounty on his head. That was nothing in the great scheme of things, with experts saying the drug war cost the U.S. $50 billion per year, and hundreds of millions were spent just on catching El Chapo. Later in 2009, El Chapo met with some of his top guys, and according to the documents that were later obtained, he told them that if push came to shove, they had to defend the drug shipments at all costs, even if it meant opening fire on U.S. or Mexican authorities. Some members of the Mexican church said they knew El Chapo was in a town called Guanaceve in northwest of Mexico, a place famous for its gold mines and tasty enchiladas. The Roman Catholic Archbishop Hector Gonzalez said that, to which the president warned him not to speak too loosely if he didn't know the facts. Not long after that, some undercover military officers entered the town, only to be later found dead with a sign on them saying, "You'll never get Chapo." The rumors of his whereabouts persisted, with some saying he was now traveling under a false name as far away as Argentina, Paraguay, and Colombia, even to Europe. The DEA thought that, but said most of the time he hid out like Osama bin Laden in parts of Mexico where the terrain was rough and any sign of helicopters or trucks would be seen from far away. Still, there is evidence that he did travel often, and again to places such as Argentina, Honduras, and Guatemala, and plenty of folks in Mexico from time to time were on the receiving end of a free meal when El Chapo turned up at their favorite eatery. Then on February 21, 2012, after being tipped off by the U.S., Mexican cops again missed El Chapo when they raided a mansion in Los Cabos, Baja California Sur. He had apparently arranged to meet a sex worker there, but after she told him it wasn't a good day for sex, he rescheduled. Cops arrested her, as well as one of El Chapo's chefs and his pilot. It was beginning to look like El Chapo had a crystal ball, but as you know, that was not the case. He flew around in private jets and changed up how he communicated with his men, and it seemed as though they'd never get him. The U.S. even made a secret plan to send in the Navy SEALs, which consisted of sending men in by land and by air, and if they met any resistance from El Chapo's men, their orders were to shoot to kill. It never happened because the Mexican armed forces didn't like the plan. In 2013, it was rumored that he'd been shot and killed in Guatemala, but this was more nonsense. Even WikiLeaks shared some information saying he was indeed in northern Guatemala, but very much alive. More intelligence said he had been in various hospitals to deal with his diabetes and heart disease, a consequence partly down to him putting on stacks of weight. Then there came a break in the investigation. Dutch cops arrested Jose Rodrigo Archinga Gamboa, who at the time was the boss of the Sinaloa cartel's assassin squad, Los Antrax. They also got one of El Chapo's top logistics guys, and so now the DEA had a fair bit to go off in terms of how the cartel's communications and movements went. They believed that El Chapo was getting tired of hiding out all the time and was spending more of his time eating out at nice restaurants in Sinaloa's largest city, Culiacan. One time, he'd ordered one of his runners to pick up the meal. That was Hidalgo Arguello, and he was arrested at the restaurant. He led them to El Chapo's ex-wife's house, but when they got there, El Chapo was gone. The Mexican authorities soon tracked a signal coming from what they believed was Chapo's phone, and in time they were breaking down a reinforced door which they believed would finally lead them to their man. Inside this safe house were cameras and monitors, but no El Chapo. What they didn't know at the time was as they'd been trying to bash down that door, El Chapo had used one of his tunnels to escape. He hadn't crawled pretty far by the time they found a bathtub that could be raised using hydraulics. They soon discovered that once raised, there was an opening to a staircase that led to a tunnel, and off they went, moving much faster than the portly gangster. The Mexican Navy were the ones in pursuit in the tunnel. In the streets above was the Mexican Army, and they were out in force. In the air, a U.S. drone was circling around. Not even the great Houdini could have got away from this lot, but all the Navy ended up finding was an end to the tunnel at a river. Little did they know that El Chapo had used a sewage system that took him to a storm drain. There, he and his right-hand man, a former Mexican Armed Forces commando named Hu Ramirez, fled in a vehicle. It was Ramirez's phone that the authorities later picked up via signals, which told them he was now in the city of Mazatlan. The next evening, February 21, 2014, the Mexican Navy, the DEA, the U.S. Marshal Service, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security were in Mazatlan, either hoping to capture El Chapo and Ramirez or at least just get Ramirez. A phone signal led them to the Miramar condominiums, but not the exact room. The first room that was busted open belonged to two American tourists, but when they stormed into the room, number 401, they found Ramirez armed with an AK-47. He didn't put up a fight. In another room, they found a babysitter and El Chapo's two young girls, Mali and Maria. He was in another room with his wife. No shots were fired. El Chapo was roughed up a bit, but he never went for a nearby rifle. El Chapo suddenly just looked like your average father as they marched him past a bowl full of fruit in the kitchen in his $1,200 a month apartment. Finally, they had him, and what an exhaustive and expensive chase it was. You'd hope that this time they wouldn't let him escape again. El Chapo had other ideas. The U.S. authorities were now happy, hailing the capture as one of the most important in the annals of crime history. Attorney General Eric Holder said it was a landmark achievement, adding the criminal activity Guzman allegedly directed contributed to the death and destruction of millions of lives across the globe through drug addiction, violence, and corruption. The U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson was similarly made up, saying on TV TV, we congratulate our Mexican partners in this achievement. It was now time to get him back to the US where he could face the music. But first, he had to be transported to the maximum security prison, Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1. His ride was in a Black Hawk helicopter followed by 2 more helicopters. This time, El Chapo was certainly not going to use the prison as an office or a place to make out with one of his hired sex workers. There would be no business meetings and no running about in the yard. His room was barren. He had no contact with other inmates. His family was only allowed to visit him with a judge's approval and only once every 9 days. There was 1 bed, 1 shower, and 1 toilet in a room that was incredibly dingy. Watching his every move was a security camera. It was 23 hours a day like this, and even when he was allowed out, he wasn't allowed to see other prisoners. The officers were even told never to talk to him unless giving him an order. The man, who not long ago appeared on the Forbes rich list as a billionaire, was given a government-approved $48 a month to buy products for personal hygiene. There was no way of getting money in from the outside. His days were spent alone in that cell. That might seem somewhat extrajudicial, but the fear was that Chapo had escaped before, and if he had any chance to wield his massive wealth, he might do it again. The Mexicans filed charges against him relating to drug trafficking and organized crime, while the U.S. was busy filing for extradition. Then, in April 2014, the Attorney General of Mexico dealt a blow to the U.S. when he declared that he wanted El Chapo to face the charges on his home turf. He said he feared the U.S. would grant him some leniency for giving other criminal figures up. As time passed, questions were asked about just how solitary Chapo's confinement was. In July, he and another drug kingpin went on a hunger strike over the poor conditions in the prison. Something like 1,000 other prisoners joined the strike, but since El Chapo was not supposed to be able to communicate with other prisoners, how did he manage it? The Washington Post wrote, "The world's most fearsome drug lord was now apparently a human rights crusader, but that he had the freedom of movement and communication inside the prison to pull it off." That's a question you need to think about as we head further into this unbelievable story. In September, a U.S. court indicted Chapo for his drug empire and also for using a team of trained assassins to commit hundreds of acts of violence, including murder, assault, kidnapping, assassination, and acts of torture. Those were some pretty serious charges, but again, Chapo's lawyers managed to get an injunction against the extradition on the grounds that under the Mexican Constitution, his rights would be violated in the U.S. It was finally decided that El Chapo should first serve his sentence in Mexico, which would mean dying in a Mexican prison, seeing as his sentence was going to be 300 to 400 years. This was what was going on in July 2015, just over a year since El Chapo had been in prison. No one ever expected him to get out. He would die an old man behind bars. Then, on the evening of July 11th, he was suddenly gone. This time, his Houdini trick would shock the world. No one in history had pulled off anything like this. He'd last been seen by the security cameras at 8:52 p.m. That's when he went to take a shower. The spot where he did that was the only place in his cell that the security cameras couldn't pick up. He seemingly walked into the shower and just disappeared. And when officers went to inspect, he had indeed just vanished. Below the shower, the authorities found a small hole in the ground with PVC piping acting as a ladder. This led down into a tunnel, and not a small tunnel either. It was replete with tracks at the foot of it, and connected to those was a motorcycle that had been adapted to run on the tracks. That bike wasn't so much for a fast getaway for El Chapo, but for the people who'd been doing all that digging down there. It was estimated that the earth that had been removed could have filled up something like 350 trucks, something that would have taken a year using that small bike as transport. About 1 mile from the start of the tunnel was the end, which was inside a half-built house. El Chapo had his people construct something which didn't really make any of the nearby farmers suspicious. They later said that sure, they saw someone building and moving what appeared to be a lot of dirt and sand, but so what, that kind of thing was normal. Seriously, did no one at all in the prison know this was going on? A lot of pundits said someone must have been in on it, and that's likely why El Chapo was able to start that protest in prison. Maybe they said his confinement wasn't exactly what the public had been told. One of those pundits said, "Here's a guy who time and again has proven he could build a hole in the ground. If they're not looking at every single piece of soil around where they have that guy locked up, then they don't have the willingness." Talk about the Mexican authorities having egg on their face. Not to mention the US feeling like some more millions of dollars had gone to waste chasing this man. How had tunnels not been suspected when the authorities knew El Chapo had a thing for building them? The man was like a mole on steroids. Digging was his thing. After his arrest in 2014, they found several tunnels leading from various houses in the city of Culiacan, not to mention all those so-called super tunnels his cartel had used to get cocaine under the US border. El Chapo was to tunneling what Ted Bundy was to killing, and you'd have never let Bundy alone in a prison cell with a pretty young woman in a hammer lying nearby. Chapo's guys hadn't even rushed the tunnel, making it 2 feet wide and more than 5 feet high, big enough for El Chapo to stroll through rather than crawl and get dirty. It had ventilation inside and was fitted with lights. The only thing missing perhaps was a bar at the end where the diggers could have a beer after a hard day's work. It was a total embarrassment for all involved, with the authorities declaring states of emergency in nearby areas and closing down the closest airport. The chase was on, again. and it was one massive manhunt. As heavily armed cops stopped vehicles all over Mexico State, inside the prison around 30 employees were held back and interrogated. A U.S. professor who wrote about crime trends around the globe told the New York Times, "It's almost Mexico's worst nightmare, and I suspect many in U.S. law enforcement are apoplectic right now." This is exactly why they wanted him extradited. They didn't trust the Mexican prison system to hold the man down, and to think that when the Mexican general attorney announced to the world that El Chapo was not going to be extradited before he served out his time in Mexico, when someone talked about the escape risk, he shrugged it off and said, "It doesn't exist." You won't be surprised to hear he was replaced after El Chapo got away again. Around this time, 7 officials, including 2 members of Mexico's Secret Service and some prison staff, were arrested. 6 others were also put in handcuffs, and prison directors and staff were fired. It's still not clear who helped him escape from the inside, if anyone at all. It might have only been the work of his family and cartel. To make matters worse for the authorities, soon after El Chapo escaped, a Twitter account bearing his name seemed to taunt those who were after him. Writing in Spanish, he basically told Donald Trump that he could eat his own poop. He also wrote, "Life takes many turns. One day you're in the hole and the next day you're on top." He addressed one tweet to the Mexican president saying, "Don't call me a delinquent because I give people work, unlike you cowardly politician." Another tweet said, "Never say never. This world keeps turning. In this life, he who risks nothing cannot win." That certainly enshrouded El Chapo with more legendary status. So you have to ask, how did he manage to get on Twitter so fast? According to the US media, those tweets very likely came from El Chapo's hand. Now, Interpol had been given the warning. Airports were on the lookout for him. Helicopters scoured the skies. Police were stopping cars all over nearby cities and towns. These were desperate times, especially as the days passed and El Chapo didn't turn up. They were so desperate that the Mexican government asked for the help of Colombian officials who'd helped hunt down members of the Cali and Medellin cartels. What no one knew right then was how he'd gotten away, or not the full story anyway. It turned out that once he'd gotten to that half-built house, he'd been taken on the back of an ATV to a warehouse. He was then taken to another city where a private plane picked him up and took him to a hideout in the mountainous area of La Tuna in his state of choice, Sinaloa. And that's where he decided it was time to get more famous and rub shoulders with a Hollywood superstar. El Chapo had first gotten acquainted with celebrities a few years earlier when he was contacted by one of Mexico's most famous actresses, Kate del Castillo. She shocked the world in 2012 when she announced this about the murderous drug Kingpin. "Today, I believe more in El Chapo Guzman than the governments that hide all the truths." She then wrote a letter to Mr. Chapo. Yeah, she actually addressed him as Mr. Chapo, which stated, "Don't you think it'd be great if you could start trafficking with positive things?" Her answer to his problems and problems at large was that he should start trafficking in love. Now, you'd think El Chapo would have almost choked on his ceviche de sierra when he saw that, but no, it seems he took a liking to her. In 2014, El Chapo's lawyers got in touch with her, and while he was on the run a year later, they talked about making a movie about his life. This is where the actor Sean Penn comes in. Through Castillo, Penn and Chapo got in touch, and the two agreed to meet at Chapo's hideout in the mountains. Sean Penn knew there'd be a certain amount of hood-over-the-head stuff going on, and he understood he was meeting with a very dangerous man, writing, "I'd seen plenty of video and graphic photography of those beheaded, exploded, dismembered, or bullet-riddled innocents, activists, courageous journalists, and cartel enemies alike." When Penn arrived, Chapo told him he was born poor, and he hadn't been given many opportunities in life, even saying he wasn't really a violent man. He also said, "I supply more heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana than anybody else in the world. I have a fleet of submarines, airplanes, trucks, and boats." That communication almost gave him away because the Mexican authorities tracked some signals and proceeded to raid the hideout. He escaped again and got on a helicopter as the authorities were right behind him. They said they didn't shoot because El Chapo was with 2 women and a young girl. The women were his chefs. But now the US authorities were more peeved than ever. This man was now talking to Hollywood stars, for God's sakes, and yet the country had been chasing him around for years and spending many, many millions of taxpayer dollars to do so. It was then decided another Mexican-American operation would be launched, this time called Operation Black Swan. The US Army's elite counterterrorism unit, Delta Force, wouldn't be involved in any actual raids, but helping by giving tactical advice. The Mexican Navy had heard that at a coastal town in Sinaloa called Los Mochis, armed guards had been spotted at a certain house. They put the house under surveillance, hearing one night, January 8, 2016, someone special was about to arrive. That night, a large order for tacos was placed at a restaurant, enough to please El Chapo and a bunch of bodyguards. They raided the place early in the morning, not really knowing who'd be there, but assuming at least some of Chapo's top men. Cops, the army, and 17 highly trained specialists from Mexico's special forces kicked down a door and opened fire. 5 of Chapo's men were killed there and then, another 6 were injured compared to one of the Special Forces men. Lying next to the bloodied men was a total of 8 assault rifles, 2 M16s with grenade launchers, 2 Barrett M82 sniper rifles, a loaded RPG, and outside were 2 armored cars. El Chapo, as always, was well hidden, and as soon as he heard the gunshots, he lifted up a mirror that was covering an entrance to another one of his very useful tunnels. Alongside him was his chief assassin, El Cholo Ivan. One tunnel led to another tunnel, and eventually the men got out and attempted to get far away from the scene in a stolen vehicle which they'd held up at gunpoint. Cops all over the state were alerted to the license plate number of the vehicle, and in no time, El Chapo and his sicario were stopped. He offered those cops a huge amount of cash, houses, cushy jobs, anything they wanted, but this time the bribe was rebuffed. El Chapo looked at them and said, "You're all going to die." Those 4 cops on the scene radioed through to their bosses and were told something like 40 assassins were on their way to free El Chapo and his assassin. In no uncertain terms, they were told to go straight to a motel and wait there for the Special Forces to arrive. They did, and at last, again, El Chapo was in the hands of the authorities. He was taken to Mexico City and flown by helicopter to the prison he'd escaped from, and there he was greeted by some men that wanted a serious chat with him. Yet again, Mexican and U.S. officials praised the great work of both sides and hailed this capture as a great success in the never-ending war on drugs. They didn't say never-ending, but as you'll soon see, getting El Chapo out of the way had virtually no effect on the flow of drugs into the U.S. and around the world. Chapo and his lawyers tried to fight extradition, but this time it did not work. One of the Mexican judges involved with the extradition went out jogging one morning and was assassinated, but it still went through. On January 19, 2017, El Chapo arrived on U.S. soil to great media fanfare. On July 17, 2019, El Chapo was told he'd be serving a life sentence plus 30 years at an American prison. He was also ordered to pay back some of the money he'd earned, which officially was $12,666,181,704. None of that was found, and it's still missing. The question is, could El Chapo actually escape again? We think the answer is a resounding no. He sits in a cell for 23 hours a day in a prison that is located in the middle of nowhere. Even if you could dig a tunnel, you'd be spotted at some point, since there is nothing around for miles. ADX Florence has the most modern surveillance in any prison, which includes sensor pads all over the floors if someone somehow went for a walk around. That will never be possible. Even when Chapo does get out of his cell, he's taken to another roofed area by a 5-man team. That area also doesn't have natural light. As a former official at this prison said, El Chapo's life is now a fate worse than death. El Chapo himself said, "It's been torture, the most inhumane situation I've lived in my entire life. It has been physical, emotional, and mental torture." You won't be surprised to hear that there was another turf war in Mexico after El Chapo became absent, leading to record-breaking murder rates, mostly drug war deaths, in 2017 and 2018. The rate went down somewhat in Mexico as lockdowns hit the world in 2020, but drug abuse went up in many countries as people dealt with the fallout of a deadly virus. And now the U.S. has a new drug trafficking enemy number 1 in the Jalisco New Generation cartel's El Mencho. He is one of the most wanted men in the world, with the U.S. now offering a $10 million reward for his capture, as well as Mexico offering a handsome reward. But again, he's just one man in a giant network of mostly formerly poor men who accept the risks of selling drugs when the rewards are so incredibly high. Taking El Chapo out of the mix did nothing at all to reduce drug supply and use in the U.S. and elsewhere, leading one Harvard academic to state, "We are choosing to throw money away to stop something we are never going to stop. So all that bragging and boasting about locking up El Chapo is meaningless." He isn't alone in thinking that, with many experts and media saying the war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure on an unprecedented level in terms of the misery and death it's caused in the wake of not working. The prisons are overflowing, the shootings are still happening, and addicts still die, sometimes from pharmaceutical drugs in the mix. John and Jane from just about any city or town near you can go outside and easily buy a gram bag of this or that. It hardly matters where you are in the world, which is testament to the failures of the war and the veracity of its soldiers. Also, as experts following the war have written, when law enforcement does have some success and puts a leak in the drug pipeline from time to time, it almost always ends with even more extreme violence as products go missing, causes paranoia and chaos. On top of that, Human Rights Watch said a while back that most of the arrests in this war, 80% of them are for possession, not sales or trafficking. And many habitual users do what they do because they need help, not prison, where drugs are usually plentiful. Since the war on drugs started, it's cost over $1 trillion in the US alone. But this industry of misery costs tons of money in just about every country. Nonetheless, just to dismantle the various industries it supports, prison, justice, law enforcement, and many more, would mean disrupting the economy, and also getting tough on drugs has always been a useful tactic for politicians to amass more votes. Still, as the arrest of Mr. Chapo shows, which is just a microcosm of the war on drugs at large. While drugs remain illegal, there's always more El Chapos. We'd like to give you a number as to how many people this war has killed since it started decades ago with that nice guy Mr. President Richard Nixon, but right now, this writer's mind is somewhat boggled. National Geographic says 2.5 million lives have been lost, and you can take it or leave it. Maybe some say the war on drugs is just the best we can do. But if you want to see what would happen if a country did something radical and decriminalized drugs, look no further than Portugal, which in the year 2001 did just that and decided public health was more important than public order when it came to illicit drugs. Drugs are still there, but things have for the most part changed for the better. Why hasn't the world copied it? Asked one British journalist. Many people now think it's only a matter of time before that happens because as things stand, the war on drugs makes the grade for how Albert Einstein once described the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Now you need to watch Insane Drugs Given to Soldiers to Win Wars, or have a look at Human Sleep Experiment that went horribly wrong.